This is the Regular Pastor Podcast, a podcast devoted to regular pastors of regular churches. My name is Landon Coleman. I'm a regular pastor at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Odessa, Texas. This is Season 5 of the Regular Pastor Podcast, and in Season 5 I'm talking about books and ideas and the day-to-day ministry of regular pastors. The book that I want to talk about today is titled Love Thy Body, subtitle, Answering Hard Questions About Life and Sexuality. The author is best-selling author Nancy Pearcy. This book is put out by Baker Books in 2018. The book is 335 pages. It's a hardcover format. The last 70 or so pages are study guide and endnotes and index, so the actual contents of the book come in at about 260 pages. The book has an introduction, and then it has 7 chapters that make up the book itself. Chapter 1 is titled I Hate Me, the Rise and Decline of the Human Body. Chapter 2 is titled The Joy of Death. It's a chapter about abortion. Chapter 3, Dear Valued Constituent. It's talking about end-of-life issues, euthanasia, transhumanism, tissue harvesting. Chapter 4 is titled Schizoid Sex. It's about hookup culture and pornography. Chapter 5, it's talking about sexuality and homosexual identity and our bodies and our feelings and our desires and all of those issues. Chapter 6 is titled Transgender and Trans Reality, talking about the transgender movement. And then chapter 7 is titled The Goddess of Choice is Dead, and it's talking about family issues, social contracts, family, biological relationships, all those sorts of issues. So let me tell you about Miss Pearcy. The Economist has called Pearcy America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. So that's high praise from The Economist. She's been invited to speak at Capitol Hill, the White House, Hollywood, Sandia Labs, Los Alamos Labs, the International Arts Movement, Princeton, Stanford, the Heritage Foundation. She speaks all over the place. Pearcy is a professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. Interestingly, she's formerly agnostic, and she studied Christianity and the Christian worldview at L'Abri Fellowship in Switzerland under Francis Schaeffer. She studied at Iowa State and Covenant Theological Seminary. She is the author of Total Truth, a very helpful book about Christian worldview, and she's a co-author of a well-known book, How Now Shall We Live, a book she co-authored with Chuck Colson. So let's talk about the big idea of this book. You'll find it on page 9, where she says right out of the gate in the introduction, quote, human life and sexuality have become the, and that word is italicized, the human life and sexuality have become the watershed moral issues of our age. If you keep reading, on page 11, she lays out her goal in talking about human life and sexuality, and her goal is simple. My goal in Love Thy Body is to show that a secular morality doesn't fit the real universe. And so in this book, Pearcy is talking about how a unified concept of truth has been destroyed on this side of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, and in a postmodern context. Science is now in the lower story, and science is thought to be public and objective and verifiable. Theology, morality, ethics, all of these things are in the upper story of truth and knowledge, and they're thought to be private and subjective and things that we cannot verify and all agree on. And so this division of truth has taken root in not only our culture and our epistemology, but also in our anthropology. And the default operating system for human beings today is that the outer body doesn't matter all that much, and what really matters is our inner sense of self. And so Pearcy's line of argument here fits well with some of the things that Carl Trueman has written recently about the rise and the triumph of the modern self. Let's talk about some of the important ideas in this book. In chapter 4, the chapter is titled Schizoid Sex. On about page 124, Pearcy is talking about young people who experiment sexually, and she makes an interesting comment. She says, the irony is that when young people experiment sexually, they typically think they're rebelling against adult culture, but in reality, they're following a script that adult culture is giving them. They are falling for a sales pitch. The real rebellion in our day is to practice chastity. That requires genuine courage. Just such an ironic, devious tactic of the enemy to convince people that they're being transgressive and they're being experimental, when really all they're doing is following a script that everyone else in the culture is following. On page 130, she notes the people who are happiest sexually are married, middle-aged, conservative Christians. And that's just not her opinion, but that's borne out by studies and actual research. So interesting observations about the hookup culture and the prevalence of pornography and the sexual mores of our culture. She's just pointing out that, look, if you're just going to go with the culture, don't call it transgressive, don't call it rebellious, don't call it experimental, just call it going with the script that the grown-ups have set before a younger generation. Quite a concept. Second big important idea comes a little further in the book, in the chapter on homosexuality. This is chapter 5. The chapter is titled The Body Impolite. She talks about worldview, and she gives a little thought experiment that she borrows from Tim Keller, thinking about an Anglo-Saxon warrior and a Manhattan urbanite. And she says, look, all of us receive some interpretive moral grid. We lay it down over our various feelings and impulses, and we sift them through it. So she's talking about worldview. We all have a worldview. We all have a framework of thinking, of seeing, of feeling that governs how we interact in this world. She goes on to say this: humans are not self-creating, self-existent, self-defining beings. We all look to outside sources to inform us about who we are and how we should live. We look for a rule or a grid to help us decide which feelings and impulses are good versus those that are unhealthy or immoral and should be rechanneled. And we get these worldview shaping ideas and frameworks from our culture and our community and the stories that we tell each other. She goes on to say this: the problem is that when sexual desire is seen as the defining feature of our identity, it becomes rigid and inviolable. The question to question someone's identity is taken as an attack on their selfhood and worth. If the person refrains from acting on their sexual feelings, they're accused of repression and self-hatred. And then she asks the obvious question: why is it patently obvious that our sexual feelings should be the center of our identity as human beings? Why shouldn't there be a cultural answer, a religious answer, a historical answer, a community answer to who we are as human beings? Why shouldn't we look deeper into our worldview to determine our identity rather than just believing what our culture tells us, which is that our sexual feelings and desires ought to form the basis of our identity? So, helpful questions in thinking about who we are as human beings, how we think about anthropology, how we determine our identity. One last helpful idea. This is from page 84, down at the bottom, so I'm moving backwards in the book here. Pearcy says, when Christians argue ethical issues in the public square, they're not seeking to impose their values on everyone else, as they're often accused of doing. They're not seeking power and control for themselves. Instead, they're working to protect human rights in ways that benefit everyone. And I think that's a great reminder when it comes to politics and policy and what we advocate for, what we support, what we oppose. Christians often get put on the defensive by this idea that we're just trying to control people and impose our values on everyone. And that just tends to shut down debate. But that's not what Christians are doing at all. Christians are advocating for policies and laws that will actually promote human flourishing for the greatest number of people. Favorite quote from the book. This is from chapter 7. Deals with questions of social contract theory and family issues. This is about page 260, if I can get back there. She makes the observation that no matter who we're addressing or what moral issue a person is struggling with, their first need is to hear the gospel and experience the love of God. The most important question of their life is whether they will have a relationship with the living God that lasts into eternity. And then on the very next page, same section, she says the reason we address moral issues is that today, in our society, in our culture, moral issues have become a barrier to hearing the message of salvation. And I think this is a great reminder in a book like this. We're not just arguing to win arguments. We're not just arguing to be right or for others to be wrong, but we're arguing about questions of anthropology because ultimately we want people to hear the gospel. And in hearing the gospel, we want people to be saved and brought back into a right relationship with God. Ministry takeaway from this book: these issues that Pearcy talks about are among the most pressing issues we face as a culture today. These are deep-seated worldview issues. Even when people don't know the history or the philosophers or the theories or the motivations, we're all breathing this cultural air. You find it on television, you find it online, you find it on social media. Certainly, pastors need to be fluent in these things. We need to know the terms, we need to know the ideas, and we need to be able to speak truth into these debates. I don't have any critique or criticism of this book. I found it incredibly helpful. I intend to use it for some teaching opportunities in the life of my own church. Goodreads has a pretty strong rating, 4.59. I gave it a full 5 stars. I think this is an incredible book, a helpful piece of Christian anthropology. If you are a pastor or a Christian teacher or a professor, this is certainly a book that you ought to read and give consideration to. Thanks for listening to the Regular Pastor Podcast. You can subscribe online wherever you listen to podcasts for weekly episodes here in the remainder of Season 5. You can follow me online at regularpastor.com, and you can find me on Goodreads by searching for Landon Coleman. Maybe you have a book recommendation, something you'd like for me to read and review on the podcast. Send me an email, landon@emmanuelodessa.com. Until next time, next week, next episode, this is the Regular Pastor out.